Sienna Robinson had already crossed the hedge gate when she understood what she had done. The iron latch clicked behind her with a small final sound, and the narrow keeper's cottage stood ahead under the manor's long shadow, its 2 windows lit amber by a lamp someone had left for her. She carried 1 carpet bag in her right hand, the seams polished by years of use, and the skin of her palm had reddened where the handle bit. The path smelled of damp earth and clipped boxwood. Her old life did not follow her across the stones. The key had been tied with plain twine to the gatepost. No ribbon, no card. She untied it with careful fingers and let herself in. Inside, the cottage was clean in the practical way of estate rooms that existed for function rather than comfort. Scrubbed pine table, iron stove, narrow bedstead, 2 pegs by the door, a pitcher already filled. A folded blanket had been left at the bed's foot. That small provision reached her more sharply than she expected. Her mother had never prepared a room for her in advance of anything except presentation. She set the carpet bag down by the bed and did not open it. If she unpacked, she would be admitting duration, and duration had costs she had not yet measured. In the silence, she heard, as if from another corridor in another house, her mother's voice at breakfast that morning. "You will marry Mr. Kersey before Michaelmas. The arrangement is final." Sienna had stood by the sideboard with the silver coffee pot in her hand and answered without raising her eyes. "I will not." Mrs. Robinson had buttered her toast with clean, even strokes. "You are not in a position to choose." No anger, no pleading, bored certainty. That had always been the worst of it, the way her mother delivered decisions as if they were weather reports. Debt had come for the family in increments, bad harvest contracts, poor shipping terms, a cousin's failed venture that had taken down 3 houses with it. And each increment had been translated into terms upon Sienna's body and future. Smile here. Sit there. Accept this invitation. Receive that man. Be grateful. Be sensible. Be useful. She had put the coffee pot down, removed her apron, and walked upstairs to the room where her father's books still lined one wall in uneven ranks. She packed 1 dress of brown merino, 2 shifts, mending needle, account notebook, her father's old arithmetic primer, though she no longer needed it, and a shawl with a frayed edge she refused to discard. 1 bag, 1 decision, no announcement. By the time she reached the cottage, Lady Hailwick's housekeeper had sent a maid with bread, a heel of cheese, and instructions for morning hours at the manor. Sienna was to report to the East Writing Room at 8, copy correspondence for Lady Hailwick, and assist with domestic accounts after luncheon if required. Wages to be paid monthly, in coin, to Miss Robinson directly. The maid recited the terms from memory and looked at Sienna with frank curiosity, then dropped a quick curtsy and left. At dawn the next day, mist lay low over the estate fields, and the manor rose beyond the yew line in pale stone and dark windows. Not grand in the manner of London houses, but broad, old, and sure of itself. Sienna entered through the side door reserved for useful people. Her boots clicked once on the flagstones before she remembered to step more quietly. In the writing room, Lady Hailwick sat by the fire with 3 open letters on a lap desk and a magnifier hanging from a chain at her throat. Her hair, white and severe, was braided close to her head. Her eyes were grey and unclouded. "So," Lady Hailwick said, glancing up, "you are the Robinson girl from next door?" "Yes, my lady." "You write a clear hand?" "I do." "Sit. We begin with Kent rents. If you are prone to tears, conceal it. If you are prone to errors, do not repeat them." Sienna sat. "Yes, my lady." The old woman's mouth moved as though she might smile, then did not. It was not kindness. It was recognition of utility, and Sienna accepted it with gratitude. She did not perform. The days arranged themselves into a disciplined miniature of service and solitude. She copied letters until the tendons at the base of her thumb burned. She balanced columns no one else bothered to check, and found missing shillings that had slipped through 3 hands without remark. She mended her own cuffs by candlelight at the cottage table, turning frayed cloth to the inside so it would look whole for 1 more month. Each evening, a footman from town brought post in a leather pouch and left 1 envelope for her on the kitchen shelf, as if placing a notice of tax due. Mrs. Robinson's letters were always brief. Come home, sign the settlement. Mr. Kersey waits 1 week only. You do not understand your obligations. Do not force me to act. No greeting, no inquiry. Once, in the 2nd week of June, Sienna held one of those notes above the lamp too long and singed the edge, and for one absurd instant she considered letting the whole paper catch and blacken in her hand. Instead, she folded it along the crease and placed it in the bottom drawer beneath her account notebook. Evidence mattered, even in private wars. On Thursdays, she carried copied packets to the steward's office for sealing. Mr. Pritchard, who had managed Hallowig ledgers for 20 years and treated arithmetic as a masculine instrument, had first addressed her as girl. By the 4th Thursday, after she corrected a transposed figure in his grain projections without comment, and spared him an embarrassing overstatement before Lady Haileywick, he called her Miss Robinson, and looked at her directly when he handed over receipts. Society's judgment arrived by quieter channels. The laundry women stopped speaking when she entered. The younger maid in the west corridor once whispered, not softly enough, "That is the one who refused Kersey and ran to wages." A groom laughed. Another answered, "Better wages than pity." Sienna kept walking. Her spine remained straight. Her hands, hidden in her sleeves, trembled for 6 steps and then steadied. At month's end, she was summoned to Lady Haileywick's morning room, where polished cabinets held Chinese porcelain no one touched, and 2 portraits watched the room with practiced indifference. Lady Haileywick sat at a writing table, while a man in dark wool stood beside the hearth, hat in hand, legal folio under his arm. He had a narrow face and neat side whiskers. His eyes were the washed brown of old ink. Sienna recognized him from church as Mr. Ellery, solicitor to 3 neighbouring families and rumoured to have no pulse. "Miss Robinson," Lady Haileywick said, "Mr. Ellery has received communication from your mother." Sienna folded her hands before her. "Yes, my lady." Mr. Ellery opened his folio. "Mrs. Robinson asserts that as her unmarried daughter, resident by temporary indulgence and not by independent establishment, you remain under maternal direction with respect to contractual undertakings. She further requests that wages issued by this house be held in trust, pending execution of your marriage settlement with Mr. Kersey." The words fell with professional calm. Sienna heard each one as if struck in measured sequence against bone. Lady Haileywick tapped the table once with her ring. "My house does not remit wages to persons who did not earn them." "Of course, my lady," Mr. Ellery said. "I advised caution only. Mrs. Robinson intimates litigation." "Let her intimate." Mr. Ellery inclined his head and, for the first time, looked at Sienna as if she existed beyond a clause. "Miss Robinson, do you intend to return to your mother's household?" "No." "Do you intend to sign Mr. Kersey's settlement?" "No." He paused. "Then matters may become disagreeable." "They already are." Lady Haileywick made that almost smile again, sharper now. "Very well. Pritchard will continue wages direct. Ellery, draft a reply that contains the word no in longer form." When Sienna left the room, she felt no triumph, only pressure, expanding. To refuse was one motion. To remain refused required daily expenditure. That evening she ate broth standing at her stove because sitting made her too aware of her own fatigue. She read the new letter from Mrs. Robinson by the doorway while the last light thinned over the hedge. You have mistaken patience for weakness. If persuasion fails, I will invoke filial duty in court and recover what is mine. Mine. Her mother's hand pressed hard enough at that word to score the paper. Sienna folded the letter and slid it under the others. Her breath had gone shallow. She set both palms on the table until feeling returned to her fingers. Then she crossed to the peg by the door, took down her work dress for morning, and stitched one loose cuff button back into place with 3 neat passes of thread. 2 days later, as the house moved through luncheon and the bell ropes shook in distant walls, Mrs. Robinson arrived at Hailwick Manor in a dark carriage with lacquered panels and no family crest, only plain black paint that announced economy as strategy rather than necessity. Sienna saw the carriage from the writing room window before anyone came to fetch her. She watched her mother step down, gloved, composed, her bonnet veil pinned so precisely it did not stir when she turned her head. A maid appeared at the door. "Miss Robinson, Lady Hailwick asks for you in the small blue drawing room." Sienna set her pen in its groove, blotted the page, and stood. Ink stained the side of her thumb where the skin had cracked from long days. She rubbed at it once, left a faint smear, and stopped trying. The corridor to the blue room seemed longer than usual, lined with gilt mirrors that returned her image in fragments. Plain brown dress, sensible shoes, face too calm for what waited behind the next door. Inside, Mrs. Robinson sat already, hands folded over her reticule as if this were an ordinary call between ladies. Lady Hailwick stood by the mantel, one hand on her cane, expression unreadable. "Sit," Mrs. Robinson said, not looking at her daughter. "We will settle this now." Sienna remained standing. Lady Hailwick's gaze moved from mother to daughter and back again, and the silence stretched just long enough to show where authority would be tested first. Lady Hailwick did not ask again. Mrs. Robinson lifted her chin a fraction, as if delayed obedience were a discourtesy committed against furniture rather than against her. "You mistake this house for sanctuary," she said. "It is employment, not emancipation. Sign the settlement, and this performance ends." Sienna kept her hands at her sides so no one could see them tighten. "I have read the terms." "Then you understand them." "I decline them." Her mother's gaze moved over her with the cool inventory of a buyer inspecting flawed goods. "You do not possess the means to decline anything." Lady Hailwick's cane struck the carpet once, quiet and final. "Mrs. Robinson, you are a guest in my room. You will moderate your tone." Mrs. Robinson turned, and for one heartbeat annoyance showed plain beneath the polished restraint. "My lady, with respect, this is a private family matter." "No," Lady Hailwick said. "It entered my household when you attempted to reroute my employees' wages through your solicitor." There was no raised voice, no scene worthy of gossip retelling. That was the cruelty of such rooms. Damage was done in measured sentences, with tea cooling untouched at one's elbow. "Mrs." Robinson unfolded a paper from her reticule and extended it towards Sienna without rising. "Sign," she said. "Now." Sienna did not reach for it. The silence lengthened until the clock on the mantel announced itself with a soft, mechanical click before each tick. Mrs. Robinson withdrew the paper, smoothed the crease with one gloved thumb, and set it back in her reticule. "You have until quarter day," she said. "After that, I proceed without your consent." "As you must." Her mother stood. "I shall." She inclined her head to Lady Hailwick with precise civility, then walked from the room. The door closed with care, which was somehow worse than if she had slammed it. Lady Hailwick remained by the mantel, eyes on the fire screen, though there was no fire lit at that hour. "Do not thank me," she said at last. "I have not rescued you. I have only delayed interference." "I know, my lady." "Good. Sentiment obscures arithmetic. Sit down." Sienna sat. Lady Hailwick took 2 account books from the side table and passed them across. "If people intend to make legal nuisances of themselves," the old woman said, "we will answer with records so exact that even Ellery must admire them. Kent rents first. Coal allowances after." Sienna opened the first ledger. Her pulse still beat hard in her throat, but numbers obeyed where people did not. Column by column, line by line, the room settled into the only peace she trusted. By the second week of July, her days had narrowed into a pattern so exact she could feel when a minute had gone missing. She rose before the kitchen maid stirred the range, lit her own stove with kindling, saved in a crate by the door, and warmed yesterday's bread over the flame while she read whichever letter had arrived from town the evening before. Mrs. Robinson's hand remained unvaried, firm strokes, no flourishes, commands arranged as if they were clauses in a bill of sale. "Return by Tuesday, Mr. A. Kersey extends final courtesy. Your refusal creates liabilities you do not comprehend." Sienna folded each note on its existing crease and placed it in the bottom drawer beneath her account notebook, beside the darning thread and a packet of unused sealing wax. She did not burn them. She did not answer. At 8 she crossed the hedge path to the manor side door, where the stone step held the day's damp until noon, and the brass latch carried the faint scent of polish. In the east writing room she copied correspondence under Lady Hailwick's dictation, her pen moving across thick cream paper, while swallows traced quick dark arcs beyond the window glass. After luncheon, she checked stores, corrected invoices, and entered figures in a ledger so heavy she had begun to measure weeks by how far its spine wore under her hand. Thursdays belonged to the steward's office, Saturdays to tenant receipts. Sundays, when propriety permitted idleness, she mended hems and rubbed lampblack from her fingers, with lye soap that stripped the skin near her nails raw. Constraint lived in details no one else would have named as burden. She took her tea standing because chairs invited thought, and thought invited weariness. She turned her collar and cuffs to hide fraying, then stitched by candlelight until her eyes watered. She learned which corridor boards complained underfoot and stepped around them to avoid drawing notice when she carried late papers to the west study. She spoke when addressed, and when she was not addressed, she worked as if silence itself were employment. The household had adjusted to her presence without absorbing her into its social map. Below stairs she was tolerated because she was useful and paid no mind to insult. Above stairs she remained the adjacent fact, the neighbouring daughter who had crossed over by necessity and stayed by competence. One afternoon, as she waited in the pantry passage for a tray to pass, she heard 2 visiting ladies in the breakfast room beyond the partly closed door. "The Robinson girl?" "Yes, she writes accounts for the Dowager now." "A pity, she was expected to do better." Was she? A soft laugh, porcelain touching porcelain. Sienna shifted the stack of folded table linens on her arm and continued towards the laundry stairs. Her face stayed composed. Her grip on the linen tightened until the top napkin wrinkled. Lady Hailwick's health altered in increments that could be denied until they could not. She still kept her morning hours and corrected letters with brisk precision, but by late July she took longer to cross a room, and once, when reaching for a folio, her hand paused in air as though the distance had misjudged itself. She dismissed concern before anyone could offer it. "Age is a tedious companion," she told Sienna when she noticed her watching. It complains and contributes little. Read me the Devon report, Sienna read. She also moved the heavier books closer before Lady Hailwick asked, and began warming a brick for the old woman's footstool on damp days, wrapping it in flannel so the heat would hold through the hour. She did these things without announcement. Lady Hailwick did not thank her. She did not object either. At month's end, Mr. Ellery returned with 2 new letters and the same expression of professional endurance. He met Sienna in the morning room after conferring with Lady Hailwick. "Mrs. Robinson renews her request," he said, offering the folded pages she did not take, this time with additional language concerning filial dereliction. "I am familiar with her vocabulary." A brief flicker touched his mouth, not quite a smile. "Indeed, for the record, wages remain under your control. There is no statutory mechanism by which your mother may claim them, absent your signature." "Thank you." He lowered his voice a shade. "You should keep every letter." "I have." "Good." When he left, Lady Hailwick looked up from her blotter. "Ellery likes precision in others because he lacks imagination himself. In this, it is useful. Continue." So Sienna continued. She wrote, tallied, filed, carried packets from one wing to another while summer turned and the first thin edge of autumn entered the evenings. On the first day of September, she found her breath clouding faintly when she stepped out at dawn with the ashes pan. She stood one moment in the cottage doorway, shawl pulled close, and watched mist gather low over the kitchen garden wall. The manor windows were dark except for one in the west range, where a lamp burned late or early. At Hailwick, it was often both. Lady Hailwick died 3 mornings later, just before the first bell. The announcement moved through the house as soundless shock. Curtains were drawn, mirrors covered. Black ribbon appeared on sleeve bands and maid caps as if stitched by invisible hands. Instructions multiplied. Visitors arrived in sober carriages and left with solemn mouths. In mourning protocol, even breathing seemed regulated by rank. Sienna copied condolence replies until her hand cramped, then copied more. No one spoke above a low register. Doors opened and closed with care. In death, Lady Hailwick became memory and legal architecture. During life, she had been room, voice, correction, demand. Now there were lists, effects, inventories, sealed cabinets, disbursements pending probate. Sienna remained at her desk because work remained, yet the axis of the house had shifted under her feet. She was still useful. She was also, abruptly, easier to dismiss. On the 5th day of mourning, Mrs. Flint, the housekeeper, stopped her in the side corridor with 2 ledgers in hand. "The family will gather tomorrow for the will conference," she said, eyes red-rimmed but dry. "Mr. Ellery requests all account books from the past year. You are to bring them to the West Study at 11. "Yes, Mrs. Flint," the older woman hesitated. "There will be changes." Sienna adjusted the ledgers against her hip. "There always are." That evening a letter arrived from Mrs. Robinson, delivered by the same footman who had begun avoiding Sienna's gaze when he set the post down. "Your delay is over. I have spoken with Mr. Ellery. Present yourself after the reading and sign the renunciation prepared for you. Do not mistake temporary indulgence for right." Sienna read it once, folded it, and placed it with the others. Then she laid out her plain black dress for mourning, checked the nibs in her writing case, and tied the account keys to a narrow ribbon at her waist. At 11 the next day, the west corridor smelled of beeswax and damp wool from too many dark coats. She carried the ledgers with both arms, their corners pressing into her sleeves, and paused outside the study door when voices rose within. Men's voices. One she recognized at once as Mr. Ellery's. Another, deeper and unfamiliar, controlled enough to make even disagreement sound like procedure. "We cannot accommodate half the village," Mr. Ellery was saying, strained despite himself. "This is a private family matter." "No," the other man replied. "It concerns wages, tenancies, and obligations that touch every cottage on this land. No one who has standing will be turned away from this room." There was a brief silence, then a chair leg moved on wood. Sienna stood very still with the ledgers in her arms, the ribbon at her waist tight against her breath. She had not heard that voice before. It held no ornament, no anxiety, and no deference to convenience. Not loud, not theatrical, final. "Mr." Ellery answered in the clipped cadence of a man yielding while pretending not to. "As you wish, Mr. Vale." Mr. Vale. The name meant nothing to her. The tone did. A footman approached from the stair end, saw her waiting, and reached for the latch. "Miss Robinson," he murmured, "they are ready." She entered behind him into a room already arranged for inheritance and contest. Chairs in 2 lines, papers laid in strict stacks, the Hailwick seal set beside the solicitor's folio. Mrs. Robinson sat near the writing table in black silk and jet trim, posture immaculate, eyes cool as polished stone. Mr. Pritchard stood by the window with his ledger satchel, shoulders set as if preparing for weather. 2 tenant representatives waited near the door, hats in hand, uncertain whether they belonged there. At the far end of the table stood a man she did not know. He wore plain dark coat and gloves, nothing in his dress to claim notice. Yet the room had already bent around him. When she crossed to set the ledgers down, he turned, and his eyes met hers. Grey, steady, unreadable in the first instant, then sharpened by recognition of who she must be. He moved one stack of documents aside to clear space before she could ask. "Miss Robinson," he said, inclining his head, "thank you for bringing those." His voice was the one from the corridor. She set the ledgers in the space he had made. "You are welcome, sir." Mrs. Robinson watched the exchange without expression, but Sienna felt the gaze like a hand between her shoulder blades. Mr. Vale drew out a chair at the side table, not beside the family line and not by the door where servants hovered, but within the circle of business. "For the account keeper," he said to no one in particular. No one objected. Sienna sat because refusing would draw attention, and, because for reasons she could not yet name, the single practical courtesy struck deeper than politeness. In a house where place had always been assigned to diminish or display, a chair could be a boundary, and boundaries could alter outcomes. Mr. Ellery broke the seal on the first document. The room stilled. Outside, somewhere beyond the drawn drapes, a bell began to toll the 1/4 hour. Mr. Ellery adjusted his spectacles, flattened the first page with both hands, and read Lady Hailwick's interim instructions in the dry cadence of law. Morning stipends, kitchen allocations, pending rents, authority retained by trustees until probate concluded in London. It was not a reading of final gifts. It was structure, obligation, continuation. Sienna listened with the stillness she reserved for figures that could be used against her later. Twice she supplied a number before Mr. Pritchard found it, and each time Mr. Vale turned a page toward her without comment, as if her place at the table had always existed. When Ellery reached the section on staffing and temporary oversight, Mrs. Robinson spoke for the first time since Sienna sat down. "My daughter's position here was tolerated by Lady Hailwick as an act of private indulgence. That indulgence has ended." Her tone did not sharpen. It thinned, a knife edge polished by habit. Mr. Ellery cleared his throat. "Until probate, existing operations are to remain stable." Mrs. Robinson did not look at him. Stable does not require sentimental excess. The girl is a burden prolonged by sentiment. The words landed with a familiar, bodily precision. Sienna felt her fingers go cold against the ledger spine. She did not move. Mr. Vale set his gloved hand over the margin of the document, pinning it where Ellery had begun to lift the sheet. "Sentiment is rarely this efficient," he said. "Miss Robinson's books are the only accounts in this room that reconcile without amendment." He spoke in short, measured sentences, each one plain enough to pass for clerical practicality. Yet the tenant representatives near the door exchanged a brief glance, because they had all heard what he had done. He had answered public diminishment with public fact, and he had done it without looking in Mrs. Robinson's direction. Mr. Pritchard, who disliked being corrected by anyone breathing, nodded once. "That is correct." Mrs. Robinson's mouth altered by less than a line. "If she remains, her wages are to be remitted to family management." "No," Mr. Vale said. Only that. No elaboration. Mr. Ellery, after a pause that admitted more than he intended, wrote something in the margin and continued reading. The conference lasted another hour. Papers passed, lists were assigned. Sienna was directed to provide tenant arrears by parish and winter fuel projections by household. Mr. Vale spoke rarely, but when he asked for a figure, the room waited for it before proceeding. Senior staff who had ignored suggestions from women, clerks, and younger sons for 2 decades answered him at once. Sienna noticed because she had trained herself to notice leverage wherever it hid. When Ellery finally closed the folio, chairs scraped the floor in controlled retreat. The tenant men left first, hats against their chests. Mr. Pritchard gathered his satchel with unnecessary force and departed by the side door. Mrs. Robinson rose, arranged one cuff, and addressed Sienna as if nothing significant had happened. "You have delayed enough. I will call at week's end." Sienna met her eyes. "As you wish." Mrs. Robinson held her gaze 1 second longer than politeness required, then crossed the room and left, without looking at anyone else. Sienna exhaled only when the latch settled. She bent to stack the ledgers she had carried in, keeping the motion deliberate because her hands had begun to tremble in small, disobedient pulses. "Leave those for now," Mr. Vale said. She looked up. He had removed one glove and was sorting Ellery's loose schedules into a clean pile. His hands were not a clerk's hands. Ink marked the side of one finger, yes, but the knuckles held old pale scars like half-moon threads, and there was a callus along the thumb web where no pen rested long enough to form one. "They will be needed in the West study at 4, he added. "You should not carry them twice." "I am accustomed to carrying them." "I did not question that." His eyes were grey, not light exactly, but clear in the manner of winter water. Intelligent, guarded. She had expected from the voice in the corridor a harder face than the one before her. Not handsome in any easy way. Composed almost to austerity. She inclined her head. "Very well, sir." As she turned to go, the cracked edge of her penknife, tucked in her sleeve seam, caught the fabric and tugged. A frayed thread lifted. She stopped to free it, then realized he was watching her hand, not her face. "You have burned your thumb," he said. She looked at the narrow red split by the nail where ink had settled dark. "It is nothing." Nothing becomes infection in cold weather. Mrs. Flint keeps calendula salve by the still-room scales. "I shall remember." He nodded once, and the conversation ended as cleanly as an entry balanced to the farthing. At 4, she carried only the arrears sheets to the West study. Mr. Pritchard and 2 understewards sat at the long table, arguing over coal carts delayed by washed roads. None of them stood when she entered. Mr. Vale did. The movement was simple, unadorned, but so immediate that Mr. Pritchard, caught halfway through a complaint, pushed back his own chair with visible reluctance and followed suit. "Miss Robinson," Mr. Vale said. "Thank you." She set down the sheets. The figures for Stanner and Lower Beck are marked in red where collection failed after August. He drew out a chair, the one nearest the lamp. Sit, if you please. We need the household totals reconciled before dispatch. No one objected. No one looked at her with favour either. Yet she sat inside the circle of decisions, and the room adjusted around that fact as evening drew down and wax guttered in the lamp dish. When she returned to the cottage after 10, her shoulders ached from leaning over columns, and her right wrist throbbed with a steady heat. She lit the stove, set the kettle, and emptied her sleeve pockets onto the table. 2 pencil stubs, a list of grain prices, 1 bent pin, her old penknife with a cracked bone handle. She stared at it, then at the frayed cuff it had torn, and reached for needle and thread. Before she threaded the eye, a soft knock sounded at her door. Mrs. Flint's youngest maid stood on the step with a wrapped parcel and a curtsy too quick to be practiced. From the West Study, miss. There was no card. Inside lay a small penknife with a plain walnut handle, strong hinge, newly sharpened blade, and a narrow tin of salve, tied in twine. Sienna turned the knife in her hand. Not expensive, not decorative, chosen by someone who understood use. She set the salve beside the lamp, and after a moment's hesitation, touched a thin line of it to the split skin at her thumb. The sting flared, then eased. She did not ask who sent it. She did not need to. 3 days later, after morning service at St. James's, Mr. Pritchard stationed her on the church steps with a clipboard of coal vouchers and instructed her to make a presentable tally before tenants begin inventing losses. The autumn wind carried damp through wool and rattled dead leaves against the stone. Widows from the lower lane queued with folded coupons. A cooper argued about cart weight. 2 boys waited with sacks bigger than their shoulders. Sienna checked names, household counts, and prior deliveries while the verger's bell rope thudded inside. Halfway through the line, a shadow fell across the ledger. Mr. Vale stood beside her in a dark coat that had seen real weather, hat brim beaded with mist. "Pritchard sent me to verify distribution," he said. She handed him the duplicate sheet. "Then we should begin with number 19. Mrs. Dallow has 5 dependents and received only half allotment in September." He scanned the line once and stepped down to speak directly with the carter instead of summoning him. "You will deliver to number 19 and 21 before noon," he said. "You will record weight at both doors. If there is shortfall, it will be deducted from your contract." The carter opened his mouth, saw Mr. Vale's expression, and closed it. "Yes, sir." No raised voice, no threat, immediate compliance. As the line thinned, a child from number 8 tried to hand back 1 voucher, whispering that her mother had sent her only for kerosene because Mr. Finch says coal must wait until next month. Sienna knelt so they were eye level and checked the household mark. The mother had paid through October. She stood and looked at Mr. Vale. "This is an error." He held out his hand for the voucher, read it, then called to the estate messenger waiting by the gate. "Take this to Finch. Tell him I said to correct it before dusk." "Yes, sir." Sienna marked the correction in clean ink. "Thank you." "Do not thank me for arithmetic," he said. It might have sounded severe from another man. From him, it sounded like principle. By the 2nd week of October, she had begun to see him in places where temporary clerks were not expected to be. At the north garden wall with survey stakes, in the tenant schoolroom reviewing roof estimates, in the stable yard at dawn, counting sacks himself when the tally clerk failed to appear. The pattern was not pursuit. It was governance practiced without announcing itself. The garden wall dispute reached them on a wind-bright afternoon, when 2 neighbouring tenants nearly came to blows over runoff that flooded one cabbage patch and rotted the other's path. Mr. Pritchard arrived late and impatient. declared both men troublesome and suggested postponement. Mr. Vale did not postpone. He took Sienna's measuring tape from her ledger basket, walked the slope in long strides, and asked for last year's drainage plan. She produced the folded map from her satchel. He took it with the familiarity of someone who had read campaign charts by lantern light. At the wall he crouched, pressed 2 fingers into wet mortar, then rose and marked 3 points with his boot heel. "Cut a narrow channel here and here," he told the mason, "stone-lined, 1/2 foot deep. Reinforce this section with lime before frost. Invoice to estate maintenance, not tenant accounts." Mr. Pritchard frowned. "That allocation requires trustee approval." Mr. Vale folded the map and handed it back to Sienna. "You have it." Pritchard stared at him, then looked away first. "Very well." Sienna wrote the order while the 2 tenants, both flushed and muddy, stepped back as if an invisible boundary had been redrawn under their feet. She watched Mr. Vale speak with the mason in concise phrases, watched older men heed him without the theatrical resistance they offered everyone else, and felt the same question return in her with each encounter. "Who are you when no one is naming you correctly?" She did not ask. Questions could cost more than ignorance. 3 days passed before she and Mr. Vale worked alone again in the west study. Rain tapped the windows, and the house had gone quiet after dinner. He stood at the table with estate maps weighted by a brass compass, sleeves rolled once at the forearm, coat thrown over the chair back. Sienna arrived with arrears ledgers and found him tracing road distances with a pencil sharpened to a soldier's point. "Miss Robinson," he said without looking up, as if he had marked her step in the corridor boards. "The Lower Beck grain shortfall is worse than forecast. We need a redistribution schedule before morning." She set down the ledgers, then noticed a ring on the table near his cuff, heavy gold with a dark stone carved in crestwork, too old for fashion. He caught her glance, covered the ring with a folded dispatch, and continued as if nothing had occurred. They worked for 2 hours with little speech, passing columns between them, testing one assumption after another until numbers aligned. Near midnight, the lamp burned low. Her injured thumb split again at the edge, and she drew in breath through her teeth before she could stop herself. He looked up at once. "You should stop. The schedule is unfinished." "It can wait 1 hour." "So can pain." For the first time, the corner of his mouth shifted. Not amusement, exactly. Recognition. He reached for the solve tin she'd left beside her inkwell weeks ago and slid it across without comment. She applied it, wiped her fingers clean, and returned to the figures. When they finished, he gathered the final sheet, sanded the ink, and held it to the light. "Accurate," he said. Then, after a small pause that altered the air between formality and something less prescribed, "What do you need tomorrow?" The question was so direct it felt almost indecorous. People asked what she could provide, what she intended, what she would surrender. Need was another country. She kept her gaze on the ledger edge. 2 additional copybooks, and authority to pull coal receipts without Pritchard's countersignature. It wastes a day each week. "You have it." He spoke as if granting and recording were the same act. She rose, closed the ledger, and tied it with ribbon. "Then I require nothing further, Mr. Vale." As she turned at the door, he said, "That is seldom true." She looked back. His expression had returned to the composed neutrality he wore in every room. Clerk, functionary, temporary man with permanent authority in his voice. Sienna inclined her head and stepped into the corridor, the finished schedule warm from sealing wax under her palm. The house lay silent around her, but the shape of her days had already changed. Not by declaration, not by promise, only by a series of practical mercies so precise they could almost be denied. Sienna stepped into the dark corridor with the sealed schedule under her palm and closed the west study door without sound. The wax still held warmth from the candle when she handed the packet to the night footman at the stair turn. He bowed, surprised to see her at that hour, and she walked on toward the side passage that led to the yard, where the stones shone black with rain and the stable lanterns swung in the wind. Someone was coughing behind the tack-room wall, deep and uneven, followed by a second cough from farther down the row. She paused at the threshold. In the half-light she saw Jonah Pike, one of the younger stable hands, bent over with both hands braced on his knees, while an older groom held out a cup he did not seem able to lift. Jonah was no child, but illness had taken the breadth from his shoulders in 2 days. When he straightened, his skin had the dull, hot flush of fever. "You should be in bed," the older groom muttered. Jonah gave a weak laugh that ended in breathless strain. "And leave Mercer to muck 6 stalls alone." Sienna moved forward before she had framed the choice as one. "How long has this been in the yard?" The older groom tipped his cap. 3 cottages in Lower Beck already. Doctor came Tuesday, sent powders. Says no more until arrears are cleared. "Arrears to whom?" "To him, miss. He says he cannot continue on promises." Jonah tried to stand straighter when he saw her looking. "My sister is worse than me. I told her I would bring broth, but Finch turned me off early for swaying near the harness room. Says I look indecent in front of clients." "Where is your sister?" "Cottage 9 near the ash copse." Sienna nodded once, already counting what she had in the drawer at home and what it would not cover. "Go to your room. I will send broth." He opened his mouth to protest, then shut it when another cough seized him. The older groom guided him toward the dormer stairs, and Sienna crossed the yard with rain needling through her shawl, mind moving through figures, names, and the narrow gap between what was required and what existed. At dawn, she took the path to the manor still room instead of the writing room. Mrs. Flint was there in a black wool dress, sleeves rolled, measuring vinegar into basins for fumigation. The housekeeper looked up as Sienna entered and saw the urgency before she spoke. "Lower Beck," Sienna said. "How many?" 8 households with fever now. 2 old men recovering. 1 woman failing. Mrs. Flint tied off a jar with firm hands. "Dr. Hargrove has sent word. No more medicines unless prior quarter is settled." "Has Mr. Pritchard authorized payment?" "Mr. Pritchard says winter feed takes precedence." Sienna felt a sharp, cold line form under her ribs. "And Mr. Vale?" Mrs. Flint gave her a long look. "Mr. Vale has been in the North Field since first bell. I have not seen him." Sienna turned toward the door. "Miss Robinson," Mrs. Flint said, "do not ruin yourself for this house." Sienna met her eyes. "I am trying to keep people alive in it." She worked through morning correspondence as if each line could be completed by force of discipline alone, but numbers blurred at the edge where thought kept returning to Cottage 9. By noon, she had made 3 errors she would not usually permit herself, and recopied 2 pages clean. At one, she requested leave to verify arrears in Lower Beck, and received it from Mr. Pritchard with a distracted flick of his hand. "Do not involve accounts in village dramatics," he said without looking up. She walked directly past the village lane and into town. The pawnbroker's shop sat between a tallow cellar and a stationer, its bell dull from years of damp. Sienna stood one moment under the narrow awning while carts hissed through wet mud behind her. Then she reached into her satchel and took out her father's pocket watch, wrapped in linen so old the fold lines held like pressed leaves. The silver had worn soft at the edges from his thumb. It had never kept perfect time, even when he was alive to wind it, but he had carried it through every contract meeting of his life and set it on the table when he taught her sums, as if discipline itself could be placed within reach. Inside, the pawnbroker glanced up, assessed her dress and gloves in one practiced sweep, and held out his hand without ceremony. She placed the watch in his palm and did not explain what it was to her. Explanation did not alter rates. He opened the case, checked the works, and named a figure that made her jaw tighten. "It is worth more," she said. "It is worth what I can recover, miss." She stood in silence until he sighed and added 2 shillings. She nodded. He counted coin into her glove and slid the watch into a drawer below the counter. The small click of that drawer closing struck harder than she had expected. She thanked him in an even voice and stepped back into the lane with the money pressing cold through the kid leather of her palm. By late afternoon, she had purchased fever powder, willow bark tincture, and enough broth stock for 4 households from the apothecary and the grocer. She made the apothecary write clear dosage instructions on one page, copied the list herself in larger hand for those who could not read quickly, and had both sheets signed and witnessed by the shop clerk, so no one in the manor could later claim impropriety or theft. She carried the parcels to Lower Beck in 2 trips, mud pulling at her boots. In Cottage 9 she found Jonah's sister, Mara Pike, upright by force of stubbornness, shawl wrapped tight around narrow shoulders, eyes bright with fever and annoyance. "I do not need charity," Mara said through cracked lips. "Then call it debt," Sienna answered, setting the bottles in a row by the hearth. "You may repay me by surviving the month." That pulled one breath of laughter from her before coughing took it away. Sienna measured the first dose, waited until Mara swallowed, then left half the broth and carried the remaining parcels to 2 other cottages where older tenants lay sweating under thin blankets with windows cracked for air. At dusk, she returned to the manor by the side corridor, skirts damp to the knee, and went straight to the steward's office with her list of purchases and receipts flattened under a blotter board. Mr. Pritchard had already gone to dinner. The underclerk blinked at her from behind tall stacks of grain invoices. "I need this entered under emergency disbursement," she said, placing the documents on his desk. "If no estate line exists, open one and charge it to my wages until reviewed." "Miss Robinson, I cannot post this without countersignature." "Then write refused across the page and sign your name beneath. I will carry it to Mr. Ellery." He stared at her for a long second, then reached for the pen. "No, miss. I shall post it pending review." "Good." She signed her own name in full beneath the itemized list and waited until he sanded the ink. What she did not know, what no one in the lower corridor knew, was that Mr. Vale stood in the doorway, shadow 3 rooms away, having returned from the Northfields with wet coat and mud to the hem, and read every line before she lifted the papers again. He did not step forward. He watched her check the totals once, square the receipt edges, and walk out with the steadiness of someone who expected neither praise nor reimbursement. That night, he made 3 decisions in less than an hour, each delivered in the same measured voice she had first heard outside the study door. He reopened the estate's suspended medical credit and guaranteed it against his own authority until probate formalized. He removed Finch from all distribution oversight and reassigned voucher control to Mrs. Flint and Miss Robinson jointly. He instructed Mr. Ellery, in writing, to draft a temporary relief directive that protected emergency spending from family interference, effective at dawn. Sienna knew none of this when she reached the cottage and unlaced her boots with hands that had begun to shake from exhaustion. She set the empty medicine crate by the door, washed mud from her hem, and opened the bottom drawer where the letters from her mother lay folded in a strict stack. Beside them was the small space where her father's watch had always rested when she was afraid of making the wrong arithmetic of her life. The space was bare now. She closed the drawer, lit one more candle, and recopied the dosage list a second time in case rain destroyed the first. 3 days passed before the first effects of those unseen decisions reached her desk, in a form she could not ignore. A memorandum arrived from the steward's office stamped with interim authority. Medical purchases for Lower Beck approved retroactively. Additional allotment authorized. Voucher disputes to be directed to Miss Robinson, pending trustee review. Mr. Pritchard delivered it himself, mouth set as if the paper had offended him personally. "Temporary measure," he said. "Understood," Sienna replied. He stood a moment longer. The boy Pike returned to light duty this morning. She nodded once and placed the memorandum atop the influenza ledger. When he left, she allowed herself one breath with her eyes closed before beginning the noon letters. The wound came that same evening in a room she had entered 100 times, carrying trays for people who never remembered her name. Mrs. Flint asked her to bring tea to the blue drawing room because both footmen had been sent to receive late callers from London. The tray was heavy with silver service, lemon slices, and 2 sealed envelopes resting by the sugar bowl. Sienna balanced the weight against her forearm and took the west corridor at a controlled pace, careful on the polished turn by the portrait niche. As she neared the blue room, voices reached her through the partly closed door. She would have announced herself at once if not for the single word that stopped her where she stood. The girl. Mrs. Robinson's tone carried the flat boredom Sienna had known since childhood, the tone reserved for strategy rather than scene. "Mr." Ellery answered too softly for the first phrase to carry, then clearer. "The codicil complicates immediate transfer, unless she consents." Mrs. Robinson did not lower her voice. "Then she will consent. The girl signs away whatever the old woman left, then returns. Affection is irrelevant. Compliance is required." The tray shifted in Sienna's grip. Porcelain rattled once against silver. She tightened her fingers so quickly that the edge of the handle bit into her skin through the glove. A numbness moved from her fingertips, up her wrists, then into her forearms, as if the blood had withdrawn to protect something deeper. She became acutely aware of each breath. Too short, too shallow, caught high in her chest. Inside the room, Ellery said, "Miss Robinson may refuse." "On what basis?" Mrs. Robinson asked. "She has no independent counsel, no practical income outside this estate, and no appetite for scandal. She was always tractable when properly cornered." Sienna stared at the blue-painted door panel, at the fine crack in the varnish near the brass plate, at the reflection of her own sleeve in the polished surface, and felt her spine lock so hard that pain spread between her shoulders. She did not move. She did not make a sound. Ellery spoke again, the scrape of paper following his words. "There are legal limits to maternal claim once a daughter is of age and contracted separately." "There are social limits to disobedience," Mrs. Robinson replied. "Draft the renunciation in plain terms. I will have her sign before witnesses." Sienna stepped back one pace, then another, carrying the tray with absolute care, until she reached the alcove by the long window, where shadows from the evening lamps did not reach. She set the silver down on a side table, and only then realized her hands were trembling so sharply that the spoons chimed against the saucers in thin, bright bursts. She pressed both palms flat to the table edge until sensation returned by degrees. Her throat felt scraped raw, though she had not spoken. The corridor smelled of beeswax, bergamot from the tea, and cold stone rising through the floorboards. Somewhere down the passage, a maid laughed softly at something unheard, and the ordinary sound struck with the force of insult. When her breathing steadied enough to trust, she lifted the tray again and entered the blue drawing room with the expression she used for ledger disputes and inventory shortages. Mrs. Robinson did not look at her. Mr. Ellery did, briefly, with a flicker she could not name, then lowered his eyes to the papers. "Tea," Sienna said. She set the cups, poured in silence, and withdrew before either could speak. In the corridor she walked past the stair, past the side door, past the lit windows of the morning room, and did not stop until she reached her cottage. She closed the door behind her, slid the bolt, and stood in the dark, with her back against the wood, while the pain between her shoulders sharpened with each breath. Then she struck a match, lit the lamp, and pulled her carpet-bag from beneath the bed. She pulled the carpet-bag from beneath the bed and set it on the table where she had copied dose lists 3 nights in a row, then stood very still with both hands on the worn carpeted top until the trembling in her fingers settled into purpose. The room smelled of lamp oil, damp wool, and the faint medicinal sweetness of calendula from the open salve tin. In the drawer below the lamp lay her mother's letters in their hard, regular folds, each command preserved like an entry in an account she had refused to settle. She took them out and stacked them by date. Then she added the apothecary receipts, the influenza memorandum stamped with interim authority, and the copy of tenant allocations signed by the underclerk who had almost refused her. Evidence mattered. She had learned that at this house and in the one before it. She packed quickly and without dramatics. 1 plain travelling dress, 2 shifts, her account notebook, the arithmetic primer with her father's notes in the margins, the new penknife with the walnut handle and the ribboned keyring that opened storage cabinets half the staff pretended she had no right to touch. She left behind the second-best shawl and the teacup with the hairline crack. She took the black wool cloak because dawn would be raw. Last, she reached for the small space in her drawer where her father's watch should have been, and let her fingers rest on empty wood for one breath too long. Cost could be measured in coin, in social standing, in sleep. Sometimes it was measured in an absence the size of a palm. A knock came at the door, careful and low. Mrs. Flint entered when Sienna answered, carrying a folded paper and an expression that held pity at strict distance. "This was delivered from the manor 20 minutes ago," the housekeeper said. "Mr. Ellery's hand." Sienna broke the seal. The page contained 1 document and 1 line in the solicitor's neat script. Renunciation of claim under any codicil or bequest of the late Lady Hailwick, to be signed before witnesses at 9 o'clock in the West Study. Compliance recommended to avoid familial litigation. She read it once and set it down beside the lamp. Mrs. Flint looked from the paper to the carpet-bag and back. "Are you leaving tonight?" "I am leaving this room at dawn," Sienna said. "The rest is undecided." The older woman gave a short nod that might have been approval. "If you require carriage to town, I can have one harnessed quietly." "Thank you, not yet." Mrs. Flint hesitated at the threshold. "Your mother arrived after supper and went directly to the blue drawing-room. She asked that you be sent to her at first light." Sienna folded the renunciation and slid it into her notebook unsigned. "Then she may be disappointed at first light." When the door closed, Sienna sat and wrote 2 brief notes in her cleanest hand. One to Mara Pike, authorizing continued medicine credit under estate account, pending trustee review. One to the underclerk instructing that all fever disbursements be posted against the memorandum already filed. She sanded both, sealed both, and addressed them. If she was turned out by noon, the lower cottages would not lose a day because she had chosen dignity over caution. Agency had to be practical, or it was merely posture. By 5:30, the eastern horizon had gone from black to iron grey, and the manor's chimneys were beginning to smoke. Sienna put on her travel dress, pinned her hair more simply than usual, and tied her cloak with fingers that no longer shook. She left the cottage in order, Lamp trimmed, stove banked, table cleared, key on the inner peg. She lifted the carpet bag, locked the door, and crossed the hedge path while the grass was still silvered with damp. The west corridor smelled of polish and wet wool. Servants moved around her with lowered voices, carrying coal scuttles and breakfast trays. 2 footmen at the study door straightened when they saw her in travel clothes and with a bag in hand. One reached to take it. She kept hold of the handle. "I will carry it myself," she said. At 9 precisely, she walked into the west study without waiting to be announced. The room had been arranged as if for judgment and inventory at once. Mr. Ellery sat at the writing table with 3 sealed packets. Mr. Pritchard stood by the map cabinet, mouth tight. Mrs. Robinson occupied the chair nearest the hearth in black silk, trimmed in jet, her gloves folded in her lap, as if she were attending a musicale rather than a legal transfer. Mr. Vale stood near the window, plain coat, gloves on, posture exact. 2 witnesses from the tenant committee waited by the far wall with hats in hand, uncertain and alert. Every gaze went to the carpet bag. Mrs. Robinson spoke first. "You will sit and obey." Sienna crossed to the table, set her bag at her feet, and placed the folded renunciation in front of Mr. Ellery with the unsigned line visible. Her voice did not rise. "I decline your terms." 4 words, clean as a blade. Mrs. Robinson's face did not alter at once. Disbelief came as stillness rather than motion. "You have no terms of your own." Mr. Ellery cleared his throat. "Mrs. Robinson, before any signature can be discussed, I am required to read the codicil received under seal with the late lady's private instructions." "Read it quickly," Mrs. Robinson said. "We are wasting everyone's morning." He broke the second seal, drew out a single sheet, and adjusted his spectacles. The room quieted so completely that Sienna heard the soft hiss of rain beginning against the glass. "I, Adelaide Haylerwick," he read, "being of sound mind and in full exercise of my discretion, do appoint Miss Sienna Robinson as co-trustee for the Boundary Cottage and associated tenant relief disbursements for a term of life tenancy, contingent upon her acceptance. Said appointment shall not be alienated by external family claim, marital settlement, or maternal instruction. Her signature shall be required for any alteration to cottage use, fuel policy, or emergency medical credit." He stopped, looked up once at Sienna as if confirming she understood the shape of what had just been said, and continued. "Further, Miss Robinson is to retain independent wage account and advisory vote in interim estate administration until probate concludes." No one spoke for a full second. Then Mrs. Robinson gave a short laugh with no warmth in it. "This is indulgent nonsense drafted under infirm influence, challengeable." Mr. Ellery's reply was quiet. "Witnessed by 2 physicians, 2 staff officers, and myself, madam. Not challengeable on competency grounds." Mrs. Robinson turned to Sienna. "You will refuse it." Sienna met her eyes. "No." The words seemed to strike the room from wall to wall. Mr. Pritchard shifted his weight as if preparing to intervene, then did not. One of the tenant witnesses, a miller from Lower Beck, exhaled audibly and looked down to hide it. Mrs. Robinson stood. "You are my daughter. I will not have this vulgar display of independence arranged by strangers." At the window, Mr. Vale removed his gloves with unhurried precision and set them on the sill beside the rain-streaked pane. The gesture drew attention because it was so controlled, so unlike the fluster that usually followed confrontation. He stepped to the table not toward Mrs. Robinson, but to the place where authority naturally settled when no one performed it. His voice was level. "It was arranged by my grandmother." Mrs. Robinson frowned. "By whose permission are you speaking in this matter, Mr. Vale?" He looked at Sienna, not at her mother, and the grey in his eyes held the same restrained force she had heard in corridors, on church steps, over drainage maps, in every room where decisions had been made before they were announced. "I am Gabriel Hailwick," he said, "and my grandmother trusted your judgment above my title, Miss Robinson." The sentence was simple enough to miss if one was listening for spectacle, yet the entire past month shifted into intelligible pattern around it. The authority senior staff obeyed before thinking. The ring he hid beneath dispatches, the soldier's map hand, the reopened medical credit that had arrived already stamped, the chair drawn within the circle instead of by the door. Not clerical courtesy, deliberate placement. Mrs. Robinson stared at him, and for the first time since Sienna had memory, her composure thinned. "This is theatrics." Gabriel did not raise his voice. "No, it is record." He turned to Ellery. "Please enter that Mrs. Robinson has no legal claim over Miss Robinson's wages, tenancy, or trustee authority under current settlement law." Ellery dipped his pen at once. Entered. "Also enter that all communication regarding tenant disbursements is to be directed to Miss Robinson in writing, with duplicate to me." Entered. Mrs. Robinson took one step toward the desk. "You would place estate instruments in the hands of an unwed girl with no name to secure them?" Gabriel's expression did not harden. It clarified. "She has already secured them. You have read the ledgers." Sienna felt heat rise behind her eyes and willed it down. She did not cry. Something steadier formed in its place, not triumph and not relief, but the solid recognition of standing where she had been told she could not stand. She opened her notebook, withdrew the unsigned renunciation, and folded it once more along the solicitor's crease. "Mr. Ellery," she said, "please note that I decline to sign this document and accept the codicil as read." Ellery looked from her to Gabriel, then back. "So noted." Gabriel inclined his head a fraction, formal still. "Do you wish to remain for the rest of the administrative review, Miss Robinson, or would you prefer recess?" The choice landed with more force than any declaration had. Not command, not rescue. Choice. Sienna set her hand on the back of the vacant chair within the circle of papers and witnesses, the same seat that had once been offered as a courtesy when she had no named place in the room. "I will remain," she said. Outside, rain strengthened across the manor windows, steady and unembarrassed, while inside the West study, Mr. Ellery turned to a fresh page and began recording the morning in a hand that would hold in court, in ledgers, and in memory. Outside, rain strengthened across the manor windows, steady and unembarrassed, while inside the West study, Mr. Ellery turned to a fresh page and began recording the morning in a hand that would hold in court, in ledgers, and in memory. He wrote each entry aloud as he formed it, the nib scratching over thick paper. "Miss Sienna Robinson declines renunciation, accepts codicil, and assumes co-trustee duties effective immediately. Maternal claim over wages and residence denied. Emergency medical credit affirmed under trustee authority." He blotted the line and looked up. "Mr. Hailwick, shall I include restrictions regarding external family instruction?" Gabriel did not glance toward Mrs. Robinson. "Include them. Communication from Mrs. Robinson concerning Miss Robinson's financial affairs is to be received, filed, and answered by counsel only." Mrs. Robinson's laugh was thin and sharp. "You will bar a mother from speaking to her own daughter?" Sienna kept her hand on the chair back, fingers steady now. "You may speak to me, mother. You will not direct me." The title carried no softness. Mrs. Robinson looked at her as if encountering a dialect she had never expected to hear. Mr. Ellery continued writing. "Additional matter. Prior request from Mrs. Robinson to route estate wages through family custody is withdrawn and deemed without standing. He paused. "Shall I add instruction to county credit offices?" Gabriel answered at once. "Yes, Hellowick will not guarantee her accounts." That struck harder than any raised voice might have done. Mrs. Robinson's colour shifted under powder. "You would damage my name over a girl's stubbornness." Gabriel's reply stayed level. "You damaged it yourself in this room." For the first time, Mr. Pritchard spoke into the silence. "If county merchants ask, they will be told exactly why." He kept his eyes on the map cabinet, as if the admission cost him. "Our stores nearly failed because medical accounts were treated as leverage." Mrs. Robinson turned on him. "You are a steward, not a witness." Pritchard lifted his chin. "Today I am both." Mr. Ellery sanded the page and gathered the documents into two piles, one for active governance and one for legal archive. "Miss Robinson," he said, "I must ask formally, do you wish these proceedings continued in your presence?" Sienna sat down in the chair that had been offered to her weeks earlier, as courtesy and now existed as right. "Proceed." The review ran another hour. Not theatrical, exacting. Coal allocations were amended to protect the lower cottages through frost. Voucher authority was transferred in writing from Finch to joint oversight under Mrs. Flint and Sienna. The drainage repair order at the garden wall was entered under estate maintenance exactly as Mr. Vale had demanded, and Pritchard, after one brief hesitation, signed beneath it. Ellery requested supporting records for every emergency disbursement already made. Sienna opened her carpet bag at her feet and took out the packet she had built over months. Her mother's command letters, the apothecary receipts, the influenza memorandum, the witness dosage sheet, and the unsigned renunciation folded along its original crease. She placed each item on the desk one by one. "These are originals," she said. "Please archive copies and return the letters that bear only personal instruction." Ellery adjusted the stack with unusual care. "Of course." Mrs. Robinson watched the papers move beyond her reach. The expression on her face settled into something flatter than anger, almost administrative in its chill. "You will regret this arrangement," she said. Sienna met her gaze. "No." Mrs. Robinson took her gloves, did not put them on, and walked to the door. At the threshold, she turned back toward Gabriel, searching for one opening left. "Your grandmother was sentimental in her final months." Gabriel stood with one hand resting on the table edge, wholly still. "She was strategic until her last day." Mrs. Robinson left without another word. The door closed behind her with the same controlled care she had always used, but now it sounded like retreat. No one moved for a moment after she was gone. Rain drummed steadily at the windows. Ellery cleared his throat and tied the legal packet with red tape. "I should say, Miss Robinson," he said, "that the codicil included one private instruction from Lady Halwick. It was not dispositive, so I did not read it into the record." Sienna waited. Ellery allowed himself the smallest shift of expression, that almost smile she had seen once before. She wrote, "If anyone attempts to frighten the girl out of her chair, move the chair closer to the fire." Sienna exhaled, not quite a laugh and not tears. "That sounds like her." "It does," Gabriel said. At noon, the administrative table moved to the manor library, because the West study had become too narrow for the number of ledgers now requiring her signature. Sienna entered by the main corridor for the first time in daylight, not through the side passage that had once concealed useful people. The library smelled of wax, old leather, and wet wool drying by the hearth. High shelves climbed to the plaster cornice. Tall windows looked over the yew-walk where she had crossed months ago with one carpet bag and no certainty of welcome. Mrs. Flint stood near the writing stand with keys at her belt and a fresh ledger open. She gave Sienna a brief nod that held both respect and relief. "Fuel relief rolls, miss. Awaiting co-trustee Mark." Mr. Pritchard approached with 2 files under his arm and stopped at proper distance. His face looked older than it had in summer. "Miss Robinson," he said, formal as ever, "I misjudged the scope of your work and your authority." Sienna took the file he offered. "Will your ledgers reconcile this quarter?" "Yes." "Then we are aligned." He inclined his head once, accepting the terms. No speech beyond use. By the 3rd hour afternoon, tenant delegates had come and gone with stamped copies in hand. Mara Pike arrived wrapped in a brown shawl, pale but upright. Jonah beside her in a clean stable coat and still too thin. They stood uncertainly inside the library door until Sienna beckoned them forward. "You should be resting," she said to Mara. "I am resting less badly," Mara replied, and managed a small smile. "The powders worked, the broth worked. I came to sign the acknowledgement Mr. Ellery requested." Jonah held out a folded paper with careful fingers. "And to say thank you, miss. Mercer says if we had waited 2 days, we would have lost half the row." Sienna took the signed acknowledgement and passed it to Ellery for filing. "You owe thanks to Recovery, not to me." Mara shook her head. "No, we owe it to the person who wrote our names down when others wrote us off." When they left, the room felt warmer by a degree that had nothing to do with the fire. Near 4, Ellery returned from his office with a narrow envelope and set it before Sienna. "Outcome on your 2 morning notes. The underclerk posted both orders before breakfast, and the credit line to Lower Beck remains active under trustee seal. Also, I have drafted responses to Mrs. Robinson's last 4 letters. She will receive counsel's notice by evening courier." Sienna touched the envelope edge. "Thank you." He hesitated, then added, "The loaded glance I gave you in the blue drawing room the other night, if that has troubled you. I had already seen the codicil and could not lawfully disclose it before session. I regret the position." She studied him a moment, then nodded. "Noted." He bowed and withdrew, thread resolved, no mystery left to ferment. When the clerks had gone and Mrs. Flint left for kitchen rounds, Gabriel remained by the long table with one final folder unopened. Daylight thinned toward evening across the carpet. For the first time, she saw the heavy signet ring on his hand in full light, dark stone carved with the Halowick crest she recognized from wax seals. "You wear it now," she said. "I could not wear it and do the work I needed done unseen," he replied. "Grandmother asked me to come as a clerk first. She said rank makes honest observation difficult." Sienna looked at the ring, then at him. "And did your observations satisfy you, Mr. Helwick?" He held her gaze. "Gabriel." The correction was quiet, almost careful. "Did your observations satisfy you, Gabriel?" "They did not flatter me," he said. "They instructed me." He opened the final folder and slid across a voucher stamped with estate seal and Ellery's countersignature. "Reimbursement for emergency medical expenditures, paid to Miss S. Robinson in full, including the amount she had advanced from personal effects." Beneath it lay a second paper. Authorization to redeem pledged personal property from town broker, charged against her own reimbursed funds, not against him. Sienna read both lines twice. "You found the broker." "I asked no details he did not need to give. I asked only whether an item could be redeemed by the same owner with proper tender. The answer was yes. No rescue performed in secret. No debt disguised as generosity." Choice again placed back in her hands. She folded the voucher and tucked it into her notebook. "I will go tomorrow morning." "I had the carriage put at your disposal at 9, he said. "If you prefer to walk, it will return empty." A trace of dry humor touched her then, brief and real. You test people by logistics. Frequently. Silence settled, not strained this time. In the corridor beyond, distant voices rose and faded with the evening shift change. The west window, his old lamp window, had begun to glow as a footman lit it for night work, and she understood at last why that single pane had burned at odd hours. He had been there, mapping roads, checking stores, reading what others ignored. He rested one hand on the back of the chair beside hers. There is one remaining question of governance. She waited. Will you remain at Hallowick as co-trustee and advisor after probate, with independent residence in the Boundary Cottage as named? Yes, she said, then added with deliberate clarity, on written terms. Wage account direct, tenant relief protected, no revisions without both signatures. His rare smile appeared, and it changed him from controlled severity to something warmer and unmistakably human. Agreed. She drew a clean sheet toward her, dipped the pen, and wrote the first line of the new accord in her clear hand, while he read over the margin without intruding on the stroke. When she finished, she signed Sienna Robinson where once she had been expected to sign away her own place. He signed Gabriel Hallowick beneath, the ring leaving a faint impression in the paper as he pressed the seal. By the time the library clock struck 7, the agreement was sanded, copied, and filed. Sienna gathered her notebook, the reimbursement voucher, the returned personal letters Ellery had promised, and the walnut-handled penknife that had long ago replaced the cracked one. She rose from the chair and did not feel the old instinct to ask whether she should leave by the side door. At the threshold, she turned back. Gabriel was extinguishing one lamp and leaving the others lit over the central table where tomorrow's tenant maps already waited. Will you be in the west study at dawn? She asked. Yes. Then I will bring the lower Beck winter figures at 8. I will be ready. She stepped into the corridor, crossed the main hall beneath portraits that no longer looked like judges, and went out through the front library doors into the evening air. The rain had stopped. Stone held the day's last warmth. Beyond the hedge, the Boundary Cottage windows shone amber. Not borrowed light now, but her own. She walked toward them with her papers secure under her arm, her name entered where it would stand, and the key already in her hand.